Dr. Richardson, thank you so much for speaking with us today. So I
Sure.
just want to ask you a couple of questions about finance. So my first question for you is, what's one word that would describe your attitude towards finance when you were in residency?
Probably ignorant. When you come out of residency, you're not really focused on that type of thing, or at least it wasn't. When I was in residency, you're spending most of your time just trying to stay alive and learn everything that you're supposed to learn and pass your boards and move on to the next phase. So I was very ignorant to taxes and finance and debt reduction and things like that. And I really had to lean on my new partners of, what am I supposed to do now that I'm actually making more money than I made in residency? What am I supposed to do with this? What did you do? And so I think ignorance is probably the biggest word that I could put on what I felt coming out of it.
I see. How much debt does a new employee have now versus when you came out of fellowship?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the average is today. I had about $125,000 of debt when I started back when I went to a state medical school, University of Kansas, and it was about 25,000 a year for living expenses and tuition, and then they always gave you an extra loan at the end of residency because you had to travel a lot for interviews, and really not a lot of people had the money for that. So most people in my era when I finished medical school in 2002 had about 125,000, and then during residency, you're typically not paying interest. That interest is just accruing. Some people elect to pay interest during residency, depending on what the rates are. But so when I finished residency in 2008, it was probably every bit of 125 to 135,000 of debt, and I think the average today is maybe north of that just a little bit. It's been a while since I've looked at those numbers, but I think it might be kind of in that ballpark or maybe even just a little bit higher.
Very interesting. So in talking about loans and expenses and things like that, do you feel like struggle is part of the story of survival for a young physician? And is there anything that a physician can do to anticipate that?
I mean, coming out into practice, you kind of immediately get this feeling like, okay, I finally made it. I've got all this money that's going to come in. I'm going to get paid really well. I don't have to worry about anything. I don't have to worry about, what I spend, or, I finally made it and reached my goal. And I would say try to avoid that sensation. In fact, if anything, I would say try to feel exactly like you feel in residency for at least the first 3 years of your practice, because everyone, and I mean every single person I've ever talked to on this subject, myself included, almost felt like I had less money when I started my practice, because now all of a sudden you're in a much higher tax bracket. So you're having a lot of money taken away from you that you didn't previously plan on. And you have a lot of other expenses. Now all of a sudden you're going to be getting life insurance, maybe disability insurance. There's just a lot of other expenses that come out on a monthly basis that you didn't plan on. So if there's the biggest thing I wish I would have done, and I've heard a lot of people in my position who've been in practice for 5, 10, 15 years say the same thing, is those first 3 years of practice, live and save and spend just as you did when you were in residency. And I promise you, 5 years into practice, you will thank yourself for it.
Wow. So is there an alternative to getting loans to pay for medical school?
Yeah, actually, so today there's a lot. Number one, there's a lot of facilities or jobs or practices that are willing to give you a stipend during residency. So, for instance, if you're in a residency and you know that there's a particular area you want to go to, I would encourage you to reach out to those groups far in advance, because a lot of groups do offer stipends during residency. And then certainly there's a lot of groups that are offering loan debt repayment of some extent, whether it's they're offering a set amount. Certainly, a lot of hospitals offer loan debt repayment, and so I would definitely encourage you to reach out. And then I would also say there are some hospital systems, they don't advertise it, but there are some hospital systems that offer stipends. I've had Several partners or urologists that I know that knew they wanted to go to a certain area, and they reached out to one of the hospitals in that area, and that hospital actually offered them a stipend while they're in residency finishing their training. You obviously have to sign a contract that you're going to come to that area. You have to pay it back if you don't come to that area, et cetera. But there's a lot of possibilities for stipends or loan debt repayment out there, whether it's with a private practice group or a hospital employed group or a university of some kind.
Great. What advice would you give to a young physician who is supporting a family very early in their career that could help them with financial management?
I think it all goes back to how much you spend and save. I had a attending of mine who was very, very conservative with money to the point that we all made fun of him. I mean, he was just that type of guy. But his biggest advice to all of us all the time was, it's not about how much money you make. It's not necessarily about how much money you save. It's about how much money you spend. And he was actually 100% correct. And I wish I would have kind of believed him then, because again, you get out and you see, you've put off getting a new car, you've put off getting a new house, you've put off getting that country club membership, you've put off having a brand new suit, you put off so many things throughout medical school and residency that you just want it. As soon as you're 30 to 32 years old when you finish your residency typically, and you want it. And you just have to fight that off and say, you know what, it's not about how much money I make, it's about how much money I spend. And that's even more so if you're raising a family. Because you have more mouths to feed and more expenses sometimes. So I would fall back on that. For the first few years of practice, live like you did when you were a resident, which means you're not going to be spending a whole lot. You're not going to be buying a whole lot of extravagant things, and you're going to end up ahead of some of your peers that did not do that. Even 5-10 years down the road, you might be ahead of them just because of that first few years that you decided not to spend money.
That is really, really great advice, and I think that's great advice for any industry, honestly. When you're young and you're attempting to kind of set some financial goals and also
Mm-hmm.
manage your income early. So, with that said, I know you talked a little bit about it, but are there some other financial goals, some good financial goals that a young urologist should set maybe 5, 10 years into their career?
Yeah, well, I mean, when I came out, a lot of people would say, well, you should be this age by the time you have your first $1 million saved, whether it's in a 401k, retirement, savings, whatever. And that's so hard to predict because, the income is so different as you go across the spectrum. You might, in general, if you're working at a university, you might make less than if you were working in private practice. And so that being said, you might have better 401k retirement options. And so it's very difficult to say across the country, what level you should be at from a savings standpoint or your goals. In general, I mean, it's true. A lot of people work beyond 65 today, but in today's generation, I think a lot of people don't want to work till they're 65. A lot of people don't even want to work until they're over 60. So I think the first thing to do would be, sit down with a financial advisor or someone that you trust, or whether it's a colleague of yours or a financial advisor that you hire, and set out the goal of when you want to retire and start planning for that from day one. If you would love to be able to back away from work at age 60, then start that process right away instead of waiting till you're 50 and then all of a sudden say, okay, it's time to sit down with a financial advisor and figure out, where I need to be.
Great. So, in talking about 401ks and that sort of stuff, do you think that a young urologist should do any other investing early in their career, or maybe even a young partner?
Yeah, I would. Now, it's very hard to do that when you first start, because typically when you start, you're starting at a lower salary, either before you make full partner, or if you're a hospital employed or at a university academic setting. A lot of times you're making a lower salary to start with than you would, say, 5 years into practice. And a lot of times, because of all those extra expenses I mentioned, now all of a sudden you've got money that's being withheld from you for your 401k. You've got money that's being withheld for life insurance, disability insurance, medical insurance. You're also having more withheld for taxes because you're in a higher tax bracket. So, and that's why a lot of times I felt like I actually had less money because I did have a 401k, and I was trying to save money, but at the same time, buy certain things that I wouldn't have when I was in residency. And a lot of days it felt like I had less money. So yes, in general, absolutely. Try to save more outside of just your 401k, because too many people make the mistake of thinking that they can just live off of their 401k retirements when they retire. And too often that's not the case. The inflation goes up, the cost of living goes up. The amount that you want to spend and travel when you retire is higher than what you think. So once you get, past that first few years of practice and maybe your partner, your salary goes up, et cetera, absolutely. I would just basically act like you don't even have a 401k. You're saving money on the side and just ignore that 401k money. And I think you'll be better off.
Great, interesting. So you talked a little bit about it. Um, the change in salary or compensation when they become partner. I know that you said that initially there are a lot of things that are going to be taken out, but what should they expect to be their like financial gain if they go from a young urologist at at a hospital setting or an academic setting to becoming a
Yeah.
partner?
Well, just talking to people around the country, it seems like the kind of the average starting salary for someone who's in independent practice. I mean, there's a really wide range. I mean, it can be 150 in some places, and it can be over 300 in other places. But in general, once you move from being an employee to a partner, it seems like most people are expecting at least a 3 to 4 fold increase, depending on the practice. It depends on how many revenue streams and ancillaries the practice has. And it also depends on buy-in, and that's something I haven't discussed yet. But some practices, there's a substantial buy-in because there is a substantial revenue stream with some of those ancillaries. And even though it seems daunting to spend a lot of money to buy into some of those things 3 years into practice, the financial return on that is going to be multiples of what you spent buying into it over the time. So they're usually still good investments, but that buy-in at first can, again, make you feel like you actually have less money than what you had to start with. So, it's tough to say. I'll give you an example. In 2008, I started in a practice, and it was an independent practice. And I would not say that this was the average salary at that time, but this is just what this practice decided to do with their starting urologist. But I made $180,000 a year in 2008 for an independent practice, and a year and a half to 2 years later, I was full partner, and then it was upwards of 500 plus, 500 to 600 range is what it was, as a full partner when you were, busy and kind of part of all the ancillaries. I know other practices where the numbers are drastically different than that. They might be drastically higher. They might be double that, or but in general, you're going to expect probably at least a 3 to 4 fold increase, in income.
Great. So going along with that, so a urologist is a partner at a large practice, and they've been there for maybe even 5, 6, 7, even 10 years. Is it wrong or right to assume that they're a millionaire or a potential millionaire? Is that attainable? Is that something that a young urologist should be able to look forward to say, if I join a practice as a partner, I'll one day be a millionaire?
Yeah, but being a millionaire really doesn't mean much anymore. I mean, there was a day where you would say, "Hey, I'm a millionaire, and I've made it," or if I ever become a millionaire, I'll never have to work a day in my life. That ain't the case anymore. I mean, to say you're a millionaire today almost doesn't mean anything, because I mean, you could take the average urology salary in the country, and let's say, I'm just throwing out numbers here, I'm not sure exactly what it is, but I think it usually tends to be like in the 350 to 450 range for the average urologist throughout the country. you're going to make $1 million in 2.5 years. And so if you're not spending a lot, if you're living very conservatively, if you're not going out and buying, multiple cars and multiple country club memberships, et cetera, and you're saving and you got a 401k that's going, it's not going to take very long at all before you have $1 million saved. But you're going to need, assuming you want to travel when you retire, you want to pay for your kids to go to college, you want to do a lot of these things, you're going to need a lot more than just, $1 million or a few $1,000,000. So, yeah, in general, I think if you start your practice in your early 30s, if you're saving and doing it right, I mean, I think a lot of people are millionaires by the time they're 40. But that's honestly not really saying a lot nowadays. I mean, that shouldn't be your end goal. In other words, it should be where you want to start from, where you want to start your goals from, but not your end goal.
You make a really great point. So there are some things that you talked about that seem to be really essential that long-term can pay off well. What are some other things that you think maybe a young urologist would say, this is totally out of reach. I probably can't, probably can't delve into that. Maybe it's an investment. Maybe it's saving a large amount of money. Maybe it's, tapping into a financial resource early on, or, turning down certain things early on. What do you think are some things that seem out of reach initially that could really pay off long term that a young urologist should devote financial resources to or pay attention to?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always going to be good investments, whether it's in real estate, the stock market, surgery centers, hospitals. I mean, there's always going to be good opportunities, and I think a lot of people kind of get caught in, well, it's too good of an opportunity to pass up, and just because it's a good investment and a good opportunity doesn't necessarily mean it's the right time for you. If you are ready to become a partner and there's a buy-in to a surgery center or a buy-in to a radiation center or buy-in to certain ancillaries or whatnot, and the price seems just too much for you, you have to do that math and sit down and, okay, how much is this going to cost me? What is it going to do to my lifestyle? Do I have to take a loan to buy this in? And then you have to compare that to what the return on investment is. And I would tell you that in general, any investment in your own practice is worth doing regardless of how strapped you think it's going to make you at that time, because it's almost always going to pay off multiple fold over time. And that investment in your practice can just be in certain revenue streams. It's one thing to invest in the stock market or buy a rental house and try to rent it out to someone. But if you're investing in your own practice, the return on investments are typically greater than any other investment you can have. And so, I would encourage you that everyone that gets the opportunity to invest in their practice or buy into their practice in multiple ancillaries, it always seems like it's too much, and maybe you're like, well, maybe I don't want to do that. Maybe I just want to be a urologist in the group, but not be involved in those things. Not always, but 9 times out of 10, you'll end up kicking yourself 3 years down the road if you didn't do it, because the return on those investments is so substantial that it minimizes that initial cost.
Wow, really interesting. My last question for you is, how do you think, or do you think that finances influence a urologist's work-life balance, and how?
Yeah, no, I think they definitely do. When I first got in practice, and I think a lot of people are like this, they just want to work as hard and as much as possible. They want to see as many patients as possible. They've waited their teens, 20s, and 30s to actually make good money and be done with training. And so now that it's here, they want to make as much money as they can. They want to work as hard as they can. And sometimes that is at the expense of good work-life balance. I'm 47, and it's funny, I tell my friends that this is probably the first year of my career that I've actually focused more on work-life balance than I did actually work. I've always been one of those guys to look at the production sheet every month to make sure that I'm one of the busiest producers in my group, to make sure that I'm one of the highest earners in my groups, to, how can I see more patients in the clinic? How can I get more surgeries in? And eventually that changes. And for some people, it changes a lot earlier. And I'm actually very envious of those people. But it will, and everyone, it does change. And you get to the point to where, you know what, my work-life balance is more important than my income. And sometimes it's when you get to that point where you actually do feel somewhat financially stable. Sometimes it happens earlier, but it definitely, it's a balance. That's why they call it work-life balance. You can't work your butt off and slave and try to, make as much money as you can and yet still have a good family life and make it to your kids' ball games and make it to your kids' school events and be home for dinner with your family every night. And you can't do both. And so, like I said, I'm envious of those people that are able to strike that work-life balance early in their practice, because it's kind of the position I'm at right now, which is what I'm trying to do.
Dr. Richardson, thank you so much for speaking with me today. We had a really great conversation. I think that a young urologist would learn a lot about finances, probably that they may not have heard before. So thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, Summer. Anytime.